Welcome to another episode of Parent Sitting. And before I get started, I want to say thank you to my friends. I first announced that I had a podcast on Facebook, and within a matter of several hours, I had heard from several friends that I grew up with in the great town of East Lansing, Michigan, and also others that I went to college with at University of Arizona, and some friends, I've made along the way in my professional journey and met later in life. And honestly, I can't express or articulate how good their comments and short notes have made me feel. I will share some of those a little bit later on this episode. I don't think I don't think that I was looking for validation when it came to the decision to do parent sitting, but my friends certainly provided that for me nonetheless. I think I've been very fortunate in life when it comes to the type of town and the type of people that I grew up with, and certainly the quality of people that I've been blessed to meet in my adult life. Also, I want to clarify something I said in my last episode about finding out that my parents had racked up a significant amount of debt. I kind of considered it debt because they were bills that had not been paid. However, it was all paid off, and my parents are in great shape financially. I think it was more that they were just not taking care of the bills and getting things paid. But I had a friend reach out, and they felt terrible because I think they had gotten the impression that my parents had been ruined financially. And I just think, out of respect to my parents, I just want to make it clear that's not the case. There's no chance they're going to be in any kind of financial distress. I was just kind of giving examples of, some of the things that they weren't doing as dementia started to grow with them. So enough of that. I want to get into the topic of becoming the boss. That is a transition phase where we have to start the process of taking over virtually every aspect of the lives of our parents or loved ones. And even though it's a gradual stage, the process, I think, is always challenging. As I've mentioned in my case, it was starting to happen before I really knew what was going on, before I recognized it, or really began to process that all of this was already in motion. But, let's be clear, when it comes to dementia, there will be a point where someone else has to take charge, whether it's you, another family member, some sort of service caretaker company. And in the beginning stages, my parents were still getting the small things accomplished, but it was the important things, those things that could ultimately really have a negative impact on their lives that began to show up more often. I'll kind of hit on the financial mistakes over and over, which I've touched on. The inability to maintain the house or even remember, their appointments, doctor appointments, dentist appointments, appointments for cars, taxes, whatever it may be. I remember being shocked that at one point we were talking about a trip to Ohio. It was in the summer, and my dad was being honored at the Pro Football Hall of Fame in Canton. And my parents had no idea how to go book a hotel room. And there was another time when they were planning to go visit my brother and his family out east that my parents didn't have any idea how to book a plane ticket or look up flights anymore. So a reminder here, they essentially quit and forgot how to use anything on computers, and even the simplest use of technology had become too complex for them. And these are things you kind of realize as you ask them to, maybe try and do some things for themselves and realize they just can't do it. So as we start to take over, at least in my case, I began to feel this incredible amount of anxiety because I began to realize that these two people, my parents, probably won't be able to survive without my help. Over time, I think my anxiety became fairly intense, which I'll discuss, at a later time. But all of a sudden, I'm having to manage their day-to-day lives from 2,000 miles away. What I would say to anyone is that you have to remind yourself that you can only do so much at one time on your own. And I learned this the hard way. Um, if you're able to have others help you, whether it's family or a service provider that you hire, you have to do it and relinquish some of that control. Otherwise, you'll lose your own sanity. In my situation and where it stands today, I usually have to call my parents a couple times a day, sometimes three, sometimes four. It really depends on the day. Just to make sure that they're going down to eat lunch and dinner in the restaurant at their senior living community. I try to make sure that they're taking their medications. I do have a caretaker that's with them a couple days a week to drive them and get them to the store and things like that. But, you also have to make sure they're putting on clean clothes, showering, doing the laundry. You even have to call and ask and make sure they have the essentials, right? Like bath soap, toothpaste, toilet paper, um, any little household needs that they may not even think of or just forget. It seems like little things, but inevitably what happens is they end up realizing there's something that they need and they don't have it. So it's all the little things that we normally would take for granted and assume are taken care of. Laundry for some reason is something that became a big issue, which I've discussed. It's still a big issue. At times there have been easily, 10 loads of clothes sitting, all over their apartment, just about anywhere you can imagine. But the most difficult challenge was getting control of their financial affairs. In the last episode, I touched on all the mistakes they were making, and I mentioned in that last episode that there were some huge red flags. And I want to share just a couple things that happened because I know that this is something almost everyone starts to experience with their parents at some point. I think from my understanding of talking to people, it's really just, different degrees, where these things start to happen. In April of 2023, my parents hired a company to spray their roof. This process supposedly was going to add life to their roof, prevent leaks, and it came with a 5-year warranty. The cost was, let's say, roughly around $7,000. But what they also did, and this is something they had forgotten about, and a sign that the dementia was a real thing to me, they had already scheduled to get a new roof put on the house the following month. The cost of that was $21,000. Needless to, and the only reason I found out they were getting a new roof put on the house, I actually called them one morning and they had told me that someone was outside and they were starting to put on a roof. And I literally I couldn't believe it because I knew they had just gotten the house sprayed. So I talked to the guy who was putting on the new roof and he explained to me that they had planned this out, well over a month ago. So anyways, at this point it's a mess and, we already have people on the roof putting on taking shingles and things off the house. Then I found out they had opened a HELOC from their bank and had somewhere in the neighborhood of $62,000 on that. There were a few other things on there that the other things essentially brought the bills, let's say unpaid bills, to close to around $100,000. And this was my breaking point. I'd watched my dad work his entire life to create a lifestyle that they always wanted. And in a very short time, my parents were on a path to financial destruction. The good news, as I mentioned, I became aware of it soon enough to make sure they avoided that. But my point here is that they had forgotten and had paid no attention to what they were spending. And even worse, they had no idea or plan to pay off any of this accumulated debt. Led to dozens of arguments over me demanding access to all their financial records. And eventually I had my name added to their bank accounts, which I would suggest everyone do with your parents as they get older. I blocked their access to their brokerage account and made sure any money that they requested from there had to be cleared by me. It took us over a year to finally figure out a way to pay off the debt without squandering more of their retirement savings. And despite their own miscues, they repeatedly insisted they were more than capable of managing their own finances. The final issue that arose before I eventually had to get legal control had to do with my parents getting lost while they were driving. What I was unaware of for a significant amount of time is that they were driving to many of the same places they had been going to for over 20 years, and most of those were within just a few miles of their house, and they were getting lost, making wrong turns, forgetting how to get back home or forgetting where they had planned to go. The first indication was that I received a call from their doctor who had told me that on more than one occasion my parents didn't make it to an appointment. When I asked my parents about these instances, I was told by them that they had either forgotten about their appointments or had made a wrong turn. But again, this is an office that they had been driving to for close to 2 decades in some cases. I was totally confused how they were getting lost going to any of these familiar spots. And to be honest, it didn't really sink in for me until a bit later. A few months later, after that, my mom's friend told me that my mom had missed some of her hair appointments. And then on another occasion, this friend called my parents asking why they were not at another hair appointment. She learned, my mom's friend, that my parents were in their car somewhere, but they were lost. And again, my mom had been going to get my hair done at this place for years and years. So this isn't like they were driving somewhere unfamiliar. This friend went out and found them, and like any good friend would do, made sure they got home safely. Now, my parents never to this day have admitted to me that they've ever gotten lost driving anywhere. However, fast forward to one of my visits to see them in Michigan, and I noticed that they ran some errands or went to lunch when I was at the house, and they would end up being gone for a long time, much longer than it would take to run one errand and go to lunch. Um, and on one occasion, just earlier this year, I had asked them where they went. Surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly if I think about it, my dad was unable to recall the stops they made or even say with certainty where they went. He couldn't even tell me what he ate for lunch. But remember, I have visibility to their bank account, so I could see where any money was spent. And to the best of my knowledge, they went and had lunch at one little place a few miles away. Another place they'd gone to multiple times. What I believed happened that day is that they got lost getting there or getting home, and maybe ran an errand in between, which is what took so long. So down the road, there were several other occasions where they were unable to recall all the places they had stopped at while they had been out driving, and that finally became really the final nail in the head for me. That led to the second most difficult thing I think I've had to do since all this started. Last spring, my brother and I decided we needed to get complete legal control of our parents' lives and finances. We had talked to them a bunch of times about allowing us to do certain things, and they really didn't budge. And at this point, we really didn't have another course of action. And I will say that this was something I had agonized over for at least a year. My parents were not willing to give up their house. They weren't willing to quit driving, or a multitude of other things we felt really put them in danger. So this led my brother and I to take our parents to court. And if I'm being honest, just even saying that out loud to this day still sucks. And it really just kind of makes my stomach turn. It was such a terrible feeling. Imagine going to court against your own parents. But deep down, I knew that the only way to protect them was to have legal guardianship and conservatorship. Fortunately, both were granted to us in a very quick virtual hearing. And I should add that within a few hours, my parents had forgotten that they were in a virtual court and this had all happened. And anyone who has done this understands why it's important. It was suggested to me by multiple people, whether it was doctors and lawyers and different people. We just didn't want to do it until we had to. This gave me and my brother the ability to speak with the doctors, make decisions about their care, their living arrangements, and to oversee their financial dealings. basically it gave us the control to oversee every aspect of their lives and to help keep them safe and make sure they were protected. As daunting as this process is, I highly suggest it to anyone that is dealing with cognitive decline of their parents before things get so far out of hand you can't save them, especially from the financial disaster. But in some ways, this was really the start of a new chapter because now I'm literally responsible for the well being of my parents. The first steps were to find a suitable place for them to live, sell their car, make sure that they never drive again, and make arrangements for them to, have a means of transportation. So, as we get down the road, I'll get into kind of I think what was probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, which was moving my parents out of their house and sort of the drama or trauma that I think they went through in the move. Certainly, I know that I felt, but I'll save that. I want to get into that because it's, I think anyone that's had to do it and move your parents against their will, I'm not sure there's anything that might be more disheartening than going through that. So before I wrap things up, I want to go to the mailbag and share some of the notes and comments I received from friends and others when I revealed I was doing this podcast. I mentioned it at the beginning of this show. This is from my buddy Greg, one of my favorite people in the world. Went to high school together in my high school in California. He sent me a little note that says, I'm literally visiting my parents this week to help with similar issues. Tim, someone who knows my dad well, sent me a note that says, I will share this with a friend. He's dealing with an ex-wife who has dementia. They have a son that lives next door and takes care of her, and she can barely speak now. From Julie, my old boss, back when I first started TV, sent me this. I will never forget the day my mom asked what coins were and how to use them. And from Jenny, another high school classmate from the great town of East Lansing, Michigan, um, she said to me, we're in year 12 with my mom, dealing with dementia and possibly Alzheimer's. So I just want to say thank you for your notes. I mean, my friends are great. Hearing from a lot of people was really special for me. And I've actually had just numerous people send me notes and things to read. So I've learned a lot from you guys as well. And I think we can all agree that there's great comfort knowing that these are not individual or isolated situations, and we are not or have not experienced them alone. So I'll wrap that up here. Don't forget, if you want to share your own stories or ask me questions, you can email them to parentsittingpodcast@gmail.com. And as always, remember to hug them, love them, and give them the patience and grace they once gave us.